All right, hello everybody, welcome. We're going to take just a few moments to let people kind of come into the webinar and then we'll get started officially. All right, welcome everybody to tonight's event, Reimagining Public Safety, a moderated conversation. My name is Michael Burrows, and I serve as director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics, and I will be your moderator tonight. So our focus tonight is to engage in informed community discussion on a pressing issue in our region and world on several fronts, and that's the issue of public safety. And our panelists are going to provide perspectives on this concept as it relates to incarceration, discussions of police reform, protest, and also to possibilities for reimagining our understanding of public safety to include things like investment in education, social services, and community development. So before I introduce our panelists tonight and talk about the procedure for the event a little bit, I want to thank California Humanities for their support of this program, which is part of a grant-sponsored event series that the Kegley Institute is hosting over the next 2 years that we're calling Humanities Beyond Bars. And it'd be a tremendous help to us tonight if you'd be willing to complete a brief California Humanities survey on your experience of our event. And I will post that link in the chat shortly, so you can complete that anytime. And the grant name to enter is Humanities Beyond Bars, just so you know. So a few notes on procedure for tonight's event. So I'll moderate a conversation with our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, for about 40 minutes or so. And following that, we'll have plenty of time for your questions. Regarding those questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little Q&A tab you can click on. And you can enter questions at any time during the course of the conversation. You don't need to wait till the end. If you'd like to put them in the queue so they're there for me, when we turn to that portion, that's great. I encourage you to do that. And you can direct your questions to an individual panelist if you'd like, just mention their name, or you can just leave it open-ended and we'll let people field it as they see fit. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first of all, we have with us Romarilyn Ralston. Romarilyn is Program Director of Project Rebound at CSU Fullerton and co-chair of the CSU Project Rebound Consortium Policy and Advocacy Committee. She's a dedicated activist with extensive experience working on issues related to criminal justice, gender justice, and multiple forms of harm. She's a founding member of the World Without Prisons Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition and has received several awards for her work, including, but definitely not limited to, the National Council of 100 Black Women 2018 Civil Rights and Advocacy Award, and also a 2020 Woman of Distinction Social Justice Champion Award. Next panelist is Dr. Brady Heiner. Brady is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Affiliated Faculty of African American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. His publications include Feminism in the Carceral State, The Procedural Entrapment of Mass Incarceration, and The Unfinished Project of American Abolition. He is the founding chair of the California State University Project Rebound Consortium, which is a network of 14 campus programs throughout the CSU system that support the higher education and successful reintegration of formerly incarcerated people. And we also have with us tonight, Mr. Traco Matthews. And Traco is the Chief Program Officer for Community Action Partnership of Kern. And in this capacity, he oversees the organization of programs focusing on providing direct services to the Kern County public, from food banks and a family resource center to early childhood education services and many more. Traco's purpose and greatest passion is encouraging and coaching others. He teaches business courses at California State University, Bakersfield, provides mentoring for leaders on diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and serves as a social pastor and community advocate as well. Traco is also a core working group member of the Bakersfield Police Department Community Collaborative Initiative, which perhaps we'll get to talk about tonight a little bit. So I just want to welcome our panelists again and just say thanks so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to talk with you tonight. And just to jump into the questions here. So I think to start, the title of our event, and maybe Traco, if it's okay, I'll start with you here. The title of our event is Reimagining Public Safety. But public safety is a broad concept. It means many things to many people. So to start, in your view, what are fundamental elements of public safety that we should have in mind when entering this conversation?
Thank you so much, Dr. Burrows, and thanks to the Kegley Institute for inviting us to speak on this distinguished panel. I feel lucky to be here. I like to start with the premise. I think everything starts with the premise, and my premise is this: that we are all family. The family in America, the family in California, the family in Bakersfield and Kern County. And so while a standard definition of public safety might be protecting people and property, I think we're really talking about effectiveness. So a better question could be, what does good public safety look like? And I think you have to look at three filters whenever you're talking about good, effective public safety. Protection that is broad and inclusive. So that means everyone in the family has to be considered, Black and brown people included. All right, protection must be equitable and just. It should not be discriminatory or biased. That means similar outcomes for similar behaviors. And it should be legitimate and trustworthy. That means those tasked with providing the service of protection must be considered legitimate by those they are paid to protect. They should be trusted by all, again, including Black and brown people. Thank you.
Thank you, Traco. Romarilyn, did you want to respond to that question?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for putting together this panel. It's really great to be a part of this. And thank you for your comments, Traco. Those are great. So the question you asked got me to thinking about who is the public? And I think historically for African-American people and people of color, we've been overlooked, not included to be part of the public, to even be part of the human family, to use your word, Traco. And so I think in thinking about this question, I have to ask myself, who's included in public safety, who makes the decisions? What are the mechanisms in place that protect us, that provide, safety and welfare for the public? And I think that there's many aspects of public safety that needs to be dismantled when we think about the public, because as we move about public spaces, as you know, many people are profiled and labeled and discriminated against. And so I think as we reimagine public safety, we have to tear down the system that we currently have that was really set up to leave out a group of people like me and Traco on this panel tonight. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of my thoughts about public safety and which part of the government actually provides that safety and who are those people that provide that safety. And historically, it's been law enforcement, the fire departments, those kinds of agencies that come in to serve and protect communities. And most of those first responders, those protectors of the communities have been white men. So again, when we reimagine public safety, it needs to include everyone who's providing the safety for the people, and also everyone in the human family should also be a part of that process.
Thank you, Romarilyn, for that framing. Brady, did you want to respond to the question?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Let me join my panelists in thanking you, Michael, and the Kegley Institute for hosting this dialogue. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be in dialogue with the three of you to share this space. Reimagining public safety, well, the fundamental elements of public safety, as you asked, for me include flourishing communities with equitable access to affordable mental and physical health care, housing, childcare, education, drug treatment, economic and social equal opportunity, cultivating caring communities rather than constructing cages. So I think that, you know, we have a single track focus when it comes to conceptualizing and imagining. We have an impoverishment of the imagination, I think, when it comes to public safety. We have a single track focus on prisons and policing, on punishment, and on disappearing people in the hopes of disappearing the social problems that those people represent and are grappling with. Mm-hmm. So I think that, you know, the carceral state disrupts families and communities. It isolates and exacerbates harm to people, overwhelmingly people of color and disproportionately Black people. And it doesn't heal survivors. It does a poor job of preventing harms, and it does a terrible job of healing and enabling criminally convicted people of successfully reintegrating in society. So, you know, I mean, there's a 50% recidivism rate in California, right? Which is, you know, representative across the country, which means 50% of the people who come out of prison return to prison. And that's after a $20 billion price tag in the state of California. So much of my job as a professor, right, is teaching. And if 50% of my students failed my classes, I wouldn't have a job. And if 50% of my university's students failed, you better believe that my students and the electorate would be demanding institutional change and a better public investment, right? So, and that's the demand that I think that we're seeing being made at a mass scale across the country, a demand for the people to have a more life-affirming return on public investment in public safety. And to define that public, as my panelists have so nicely put it, right, in an inclusive, expansive, right, and equal way. And that requires reimagining public safety beyond policing and prisons, and thinking about, you know, flourishing communities and some of those, some of the equitable access to care that I mentioned at the outset.
Yeah, so I mean, all three responses, I mean, just thank you so much for them. It really, I think, sets us off on a nice tone of really kind of broadening this concept and idea of public safety. So not so narrowly focused, say, thinking of just policing or crime prevention in a very traditional sense of the word, but thinking about flourishing communities, thinking about who's included in these considerations of public safety and community flourishing. But I want to dwell for a moment on this notion of kind of the carceral society, Brady, that you mentioned, and incarceration in California, particularly just given the scale of incarceration in our state, right, where we all live and reside. And I was wondering if you could maybe shed some light and give some information to the audience tonight about the scale of incarceration in California and the Central Valley, you know, where we're based here. Could you shed some light on that for us tonight?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I'm gonna, for the visually inclined, going to share some slides if that works.
Yeah, that looks great.
Can folks see that?
Yes.
All right. So I was born and raised in the Central Valley, born and raised in California during the prison boom. During a period of time when California built 23 prisons in a span of 20 years and one public university. And so the growth of the prison industrial complex in the Central Valley is something that has been formative to my experience and really formative for my life's work. So as you can see, California incarcerates, when you include state prisons and local jails and federal prisons, 239,000 people. When you take into consideration those on probation or parole, that number jumps to 565,000 people under some form of carceral control. We have in the last decade or so, the number of people incarcerated in the state of California in the state prison system has started to decline, largely because the Supreme Court in the Plata v. Brown case concluded that to exist, to live in a California state prison is to have your Eighth Amendment, rights against protections against cruel and unusual punishment violated because of the degree of overpopulation of the institutions. So it's really that that intervention that led to, as well as some progressive criminal justice reform in recent years, that has led to that decline. But still, when you think of California as a country and compare it with the rest of the world, as you can see here, these are incarceration rates. California has in terms of sheer number, California has the third largest prison system on the planet, behind China and the United States as a whole. And when you look at incarceration rates, California clearly and significantly outpaces every other country among the NATO countries. So that's just to say that California is the aberration from the norm, not the norm. And when you look at the cost of this investment of public wealth into incarceration, you can see that it's precipitous, right? We're now spending about $20 billion a year in California on the criminal legal system. And so you'll note that even though the number of people incarcerated in the state of California has declined in the last decade, the amount of general fund expenditures devoted to prisons and criminal legal procedures has continued to increase, right? So when I was saying earlier about demanding a better return on public investment, this is partly what I was referring to. And just quickly, since you asked about the Central Valley, this is a map of all of the state prisons in the state of California. It's from the Department of Corrections. And you can see here as I blow it up, that just between Fresno and the Grapevine, there are 9 state prisons. 9 state prisons. So in a stone's throw from, I take it, many of our audience members in Kern County, they can walk out their door, throw a stone, and are likely to encounter a prison. So it's when I was being raised in the Central Valley, prison expansion was really sold to our communities as economic stimulus, right? As a way to create jobs. And it was almost exclusively framed in cost-benefit economic kinds of terms. Rarely was there a reference to the humans, the people and the families who would serve as the fodder for those industries. But as you can see, Ruthie Gilmore, a critical geographer, joins with a number of anti-prison activists in referring to the Central Valley as Prison Alley, in large part because of this the centralization and growth of mass incarceration in the state of California, specifically in the Central Valley.
Brady, thanks so much for sharing those slides. I mean, it's beyond striking, but it's just super informative and educating us tonight. So thank you for that. And Romarilyn, I want to ask you about this question too, and the scale of incarceration in California. And I know both you and Brady work very closely on issues of incarceration and supporting formerly incarcerated students. Is there anything else you wanted to add to this question in terms of how we can think about the scale and impact of incarceration in our state and in the Central Valley?
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Brady, for all of those slides. They're really great. And I think it showed the expansion of prisons across the state. We have 35 prisons in this state, and 9 right there in the Central Valley that Brady showed. But what we didn't see on that slide was that there's also juvenile facilities in the same area. And so when we look at the scale of incarceration in this state, we need to consider, that there are adult and juvenile facilities that is costing the state billions of dollars to fund. And in this state, just to give you a few facts, who are the people that are in these 35 prisons? We currently have approximately 100,000 individuals incarcerated in adult prison. And who are they? 1 in 8 Black men in California are incarcerated. That's who's in those prisons. Most of the folks in those prisons are serving life, virtual life, life without the possibility of parole. There's approximately 40,000 lifers in those prisons. And it's raising the cost of incarceration, and aging individuals who are incarcerated, really pose low to no risk. So when we think about the scale of incarceration in this state and the growing age of the population, and when we look at 40% of the population is aging because they're serving life sentences, we should take pause to that. We should think about where our money is being invested. And just a couple more facts when it comes to the demographics of those who are serving time. California is the worst state in the US when it comes to systemic racist disparities in mass incarceration. California is worse in incarcerating Black men than Mississippi and Louisiana. And when we think of those southern states, we primarily think that these are the states where we should see a lot of racial bias, but not. California, the West Coast, the liberal state is leading the pack. And lastly, since August of 2019, Black and Latinx people make up more than 90% of the people incarcerated in adult facilities. So incarceration in the state of California is devastating Black and brown communities. So, when we look at prisons and we look at the Central Valley, most Black people don't live in the Central Valley. They're either in Southern California, Northern California. So the cost of incarceration on families, we also need to talk about and consider. Folks have to travel very long distances to see their loved ones, the cost of phone calls and packages to support individuals inside. It's ridiculous. And when we look at the scale and scope of incarceration, there's just so many factors to consider. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks so much, Romarilyn. And everybody also, we have some great questions coming in through the Q&A function. Keep those coming. We'll begin to those shortly. So feel free to keep posting those, and like I said, we'll get to those in a moment. Romarilyn, I want to stick with you for a moment here, and I want to ask you, so much of your work with Project Rebound focuses on education, right, and supporting formerly incarcerated students in their pursuit of degrees and transformative experiences within the CSU system, CSU Fullerton specifically, but also more broadly with the Consortium. Can you talk to us about, what role does education play in reimagining public safety? Because I think a lot of times when we're thinking about public safety, people aren't automatically thinking of education as an element of that. But I feel like your work maybe demonstrates that it is. And I'm wondering if you could shed some light on that for us.
I think the work of Project Rebound is definitely allowing folks who have an incarceration experience to regain their life through higher education as their transformative practice. I think there's other programs within the UC and the community colleges that also support formerly incarcerated students that help those who have an incarceration experience reinvent themselves, and that's really important. But that's not the whole picture. The work that Brady and I do, or the work of Underground Scholars and other organizations, when we have so many more public schools, high schools, elementary schools that still have resource officers, creating this school to prison pipeline and pushing people continuously into the carceral system. So I think we need to think about education at all levels of education and how we reimagine public safety. The work that, again, Brady and I do, is fantastic across the consortium of 14 programs. And we see more and more students reaching out to us from those 35 prisons every day, wanting to be a part of Project Rebound, be a part of the CSU system, and get their college degree. Because most people who are incarcerated realize that when you are released, there's a 50% chance that you're going to go back to prison if you continue to do things the same way. And so higher education has been one of those roads that the prison system has allowed for us as a formerly incarcerated person to be involved in while you serve your time. So getting involved in higher education programs, and once you start to learn about these systems in place that create this kind of revolving door policies, the laws and practices of the land that are set up for certain people to be part of this system, you realize you don't want to play that game anymore, and you don't want to be a part of it. So education is really key to helping us think critically about who we are, our positionality within the world, our experiences as a formerly incarcerated person, but also, what we want to bring home to our families. Because we know that, folks who are incarcerated and have children, their children are more likely to become incarcerated. So education helps us to break that generational cycle, that intergenerational cycle of poverty and incarceration. So I'll just end with that before I start talking about something else that's a little off topic.
No worries. Thank you, Romarilyn. Brady, anything you want to add on that in regards to education, public safety? Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I'd love to add a couple of things. So California has the largest public post-secondary system in the country. It's 3 segments of public post-secondary education, alongside, right, that the largest prison system in the country. And when you look at the public spending on higher education versus on prisons, you can see that over 20 years, from about 1983 to 2000, 1990 to 2010, thereabouts, spending on prisons went up by 430%, adjusted for inflation, while spending on higher education went down by 13%. In the same time, and those 2 systems draw from the same pool of public, tax revenue, right? The general fund, and so, but educational institutions, I think, are indispensable for scaling a life-affirming response to mass incarceration, right? And as Romarilyn mentioned, education at all levels, right? We've seen in the pandemic the role that K-12 schools, the role that post-secondary institutions have played in supporting and lifting up and attending to the basic needs of neighborhoods, right? I mean, the K-12 schools have been the sites for the distribution of, thousands and thousands of meals each month, right? So part of what has happened, I think, is that, you know, investment in a one-track conception of public safety that's investing, you know, in prisons and policing, has squandered the very public resources that we would need in order to build more safety, right? And so we have teachers who are going to parents and drawing from their own purses to buy pencils, right? And supplies, right? And, you know, and so much of the welfare of the community is weighing on schools, right? Part of that is because prisons and policing budgets have consumed, you know, all of those resources that arguably, in a more life-affirming conception, right, would be invested in drug treatment programs, mental and physical, you know, healthcare, social work, and childcare, et cetera. So, and what we have done through Project Rebound, I think, is really leverage public comprehensive universities and their mandate for providing equitable access and attending to the basic needs of students. We have leveraged that to build, you know, to cultivate communities of care, to build life-affirming communities, cultures of belonging through, you know, addressing the food insecurities of students, the housing insecurities of students, all of the barriers and roadblocks that students encounter just getting to class. Right now, it's their virtual class for the moment, right? But that's not about academic performance. That's just about, you know, allowing folks equitable opportunity, right? So I think that Angela Y. Davis, a critical feminist philosopher and an abolitionist, has said that that abolitionism will require schools to become institutions, you know, machines for decarceration, agents of decarceration. So I think educational institutions at all levels are indispensable partners in that effort.
Thank you so much, Brady and Romarilyn. Traco, I want to turn to you and shift focus here a little bit. So obviously, you know, I don't think we can talk about current concerns around public safety without talking about a lot of the conversations that are happening in our region, our nation, and our world around police reform. And, you know, there are real kind of radical elements of disagreement in our communities when it comes to police reform, what that should look like, whether reform is even an option. And I wanted to ask you, you know, what does constructive reform look like in your eyes? And, you know, also maybe are there areas of common ground that in your view are overlooked in some of the disagreements about what positive reform could look like when it comes to policing?
Well, thank you for the question, Michael. That's the tough one that'll get me in trouble, I'm sure. But to frame my response, that was a lot of questions too. I'll try to remember all of them. I like to frame it by thinking of kind of the world of crime and from two perspectives, all right? There are two major worlds. There's the world of response, and that's law enforcement agencies, police departments, sheriff's departments, the court systems, corrections, et cetera. And then there's a whole world out there of really upstream crime prevention, all right? Looking at what are some of the factors maybe that are contributing to why all of these folks are getting arrested, whether it's as Romarilyn and Brady were talking about, education, maybe that's a factor. We know that poverty is a factor. I'm sure that some folks will be surprised to learn that research shows that for folks who are incarcerated for the first time, they come from houses making $37,000 or less 80% of the time. All right. And so there are some tremendous factors that maybe we haven't thought about. And maybe if we address those, this response we could diminish. So that's kind of the two worlds or the two realms that I like to think about. And I know it's controversial, but I really believe that a lot of folks who are crying for police departments to be defunded or abolished That might not be the best language, but really what they're saying is you've done this response side literally for generations, and the results have not been good. And as a Black man in America, I can tell you the results have not been good for my family personally, for people that I know. There's this wide disparity. And so to continually argue that the response side, spending more money to try to kill all crime by responding more effectively, that hasn't worked like we thought it was going to work. We have more people in prison now. I think nationally over 2.3 million people. And in 1983, we had 300,000. And crime hasn't really diminished or reduced. And so I think what they're saying is maybe we should take a stab at this other side of the equation. And there are a lot of ways that there's a lot of language that we might use. People talk about defunding or reallocation or whatever. But really, it's just saying maybe we should consider this other world that we haven't really given a lot of time, focus, and money to. And I know that a lot of language, strong language has been used on both sides. I think that voice matters, and hopefully we get to talk a little bit more about that later on. But I do feel this way. In order for us to find common ground, we have to land on some facts. And so personally, when I'm trying to figure out where my heart is on something, I like to use a little short acronym that I'll share with everyone. And then we can kind of just assess where we are before we try to determine where we need to go as it's related to these two worlds. So the H stands for high priority. What do you prioritize first? And as an individual, maybe as part of your purpose or your vision, but as an organization or a city or a county, where is it on your strategic plan? Where is it in your policies? Does it matter? We always talk about dollars and money, and we'll get there. But the E is for engagement. Which world do you engage in the most? This response world or this preventative world? Acumen, acquirement. Where are you learning? Are you doing most of your research and your study on the response side or on the prevention side? And then, of course, resources, your time and money. Where are you investing? All right, your time and your money. What percentage of your budget goes to this world versus this world? And then finally, tracking. If you really care about something, you measure the results. That's a given, or that's a maxim. And so are you measuring results on this side? Or are you measuring results on this side? And one thing that I have not seen much of is measurement of crime reduction or flourishing, as Brady spoke to in his first response. Are we flourishing better in terms of all of our communities, all parts of the family? And so I think if you just would indulge me for a moment, like close your eyes and think about that acronym. Where's our heart as a community, as a state, as a nation? I think the answer is clear. All right, the answer is clear. And so when folks talk about defunding or reallocation, what they're saying is maybe we should move more of our heart from just this response side, because it hasn't been effective and it hasn't been equitable, to this prevention upstream side. And what does that look like?
Thank you, Traco. And I think you've brought up a really important concept there in this notion of kind of reform and defunding conversations. And, of course, we've heard that ourselves in Bakersfield, doing listening sessions with the community around police reform conversations here. And these discussions of defunding the police were a prominent part of those conversations in terms of some community voices being represented there, including a lot of Bakersfield youth at those meetings. So I wanted to maybe dwell on that a little bit more, and maybe Brady, I wanted to invite you to maybe share some thoughts on this if you have some here. And basically, the way I'll pose the question is, there's been a significant movement or movements really in our nation around the call for defunding the police, but I think there's a lot of confusion about this term. And Traco, I think, was giving us some good insight on it. But there are varying interpretations of what a call to defund means. So what do you take that call to mean? And secondarily, do you think it's a useful call at this historical moment or a distracting one?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So again, I'm going to make reference to Angela Y. Davis, who builds upon the work of Frederick Douglass at the turn of the 19th century when talking about the abolition of slavery. And what Douglass argued is that slavery was not was abolished in the formal sense, right? The 13th Amendment was ratified, although as an increasing degree of activism and education has elevated our consciousness nationally to understand that that amendment includes a loophole, right, for those who are convicted of a crime. But what Douglass said is that, you know, slavery was abolished in the negative sense, but not in the comprehensive sense, right? Which is to say that the institutions that would have been required to fully integrate and provide opportunity for emancipated African Americans were not built, right? And so Angela Davis argues similarly that abolition, this time now speaking in the context of the late 20th and early 21st century, abolishing prisons as we understand them, which is an indispensable part of the pursuit of racial justice, involves two parts, right? A negative part, it is about dismantling prisons and police. But it's also, as I led with, and as my panelists have also eloquently spoken to, it's about constructing, investing and building institutions that actually affirm the lives of marginalized people and Black people in particular. And so I think that the call for defunding police is essential and literal, but also a gradual, you know, but also a long-term strategy, right? But I think that the messaging of defunding, it speaks to the negative aspect of abolition, the dismantling of the institutions and practices of racialized state violence. But it doesn't speak to the constructive and positive aspect of building up those diverse institutions necessary to render prisons and policing obsolete, right? Now, I'm not saying that members, you know, that activists in the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund police movement are not offering those constructive alternatives. They are, right? But a single, you know, a sort of narrow focus on the negative side of that project and not also the constructive side, I think leaves a vacuum of imagination for folks who need to have aspiration, inspiration, right? And fodder for the imagination about what the alternatives to the system that we have, that Traco has mentioned are not working for us. And there's one, if I could again just share an image that I think speaks to this problem. You have a lot of folks who, when encountering the slogan or the position of defunding the police, find it difficult to imagine, like, well, what would safety, you know, what would safety look like, right? You know, and how are the police supposed to do all of the things that we call upon them to do if we reduce their budgets? But the reality is that the policing function in our society has colonized, or another way of putting it, has been called upon by society with the erosion of other social institutions to do way, way more than any single public agency should be called upon to do. And so I think it would be, you know, a welcome reprieve for many folks in law enforcement not to have to be the first line response for a panoply of social problems, right? that they are not trained and not equipped to address, right? The reality is that the vast majority of calls that police receive would be better, are not about preventing harms, right? And are not violent, are not instances of violence, right? But would be better addressed by social workers, by mental health clinicians, and community response kinds of teams, will be better addressed by opportunities for career development and equitable access to education, and all those other institutions that all of the panelists, I think, have spoken to. And so I think that defunding police and prisons, taking some of that $20 billion in California that we're investing each year with declining results, right? And investing it into a whole host of other life-affirming kinds of practices and institutions is part of the constructive, right, positive aspect of abolition, that a narrow focus just on the defunding part, right, which again is an essential part, right, because that's where the resources need to come from. But it's only one side of, I think, a two-sided project.
Thank you, Brady. Romarilyn, did you have anything to add there to that question in particular? You're on mute there, Romarilyn.
Bro, you're muted.
I think abolitionists and activists and advocates know exactly what defund the police means. I think there's fear in the minds of some individuals who think that defund the police means shut down the police departments and close them down and get rid of law enforcement altogether. I think in their imagination, they are, not really thinking clearly. I mean, those who think that the defund the police call is to do away with all types of law enforcement, they can't possibly, really think that in the society that we have today. And so I think in their imagination, it is just a way of pushing back against the call to shift funds, to shift these big budgets that Brady mentions from corrections, from law enforcement to the community. We don't need tanks in our communities. We don't need law enforcement with militarized rifles. We are citizens. We are the public. We don't need to be at war with the folks who are supposed to protect and serve us. And so I just wanted to add that, because I think this idea that defund the police is to do away with, any type of judicial process is ludicrous. Mm-hmm. That's just my thought on that. But secondly, it's about removing some of the power that the police have in our communities and over our bodies in Black and Brown communities. Mm-hmm. The slide that Brady showed is a great illustration that the police have taken on way too many roles in our communities, whether they were called upon or they colonized these roles or whatever they've done. And so to take funding from them is to also, disempower some of the power that they have. So to take some of that away is causing a lot of law enforcement, police officers and others, some stress, and that's good. They should want to really protect and serve the community and not just use force and brutality over people who are vulnerable, because that only makes you a bully. That doesn't make you, an officer of the law. So I just wanted to add those couple of thoughts with that, and say that defunding the police, I think is one of the greatest movements we've had in this country in this century. So I'm very proud of what's happening with that.
Thank you, Romarilyn. And you know, we have at this point a lot of questions in the queue from the audience. I want to transition over to some of these, and they're really wonderful questions, and I'll continue on some of the themes we've talked about and introduce some new ones. But the first question kind of falls appropriate upon what we've been talking about, and it's from an anonymous attendee. And they write, what specific reforms should police and/or sheriff departments implement to achieve effective reimagined public safety? Traco, could we start with you on that question?
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to dive into that, because what we're doing right now with the Bakersfield Police Department Community Collaborative is looking at what they have done historically, what they're doing currently today in terms of their policies and practices, and trying to develop recommendations. And I think that one of the things that, so a lot of that work is still in process. And I don't want to get ahead of myself before there's consensus on what those recommendations should be to City Council. But I do know this, so too often, these gaps and these disparities, these inequities are due to, frankly, a lack of data. And if you go to their website, you can see a little bit. You know, 3 years ago, they kind of came out with a 2 or 3 page report that covers some information, but you would have no clue on what kind of disparities there are in terms of what the response is for Black and brown people versus everyone else, with multiple categories, because it's not broken down by demographics. And so I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that data quality has got to be better in order for us to understand current state and where we need to go, what the recommendations and changes should be. It's really difficult to say, hey, let's go a mile in this direction when we don't know where we stand today. We know that there's some anecdotal and frankly reports that we've gotten over the last 5 to 10 years from the Guardian, the ACLU, et cetera. The DOJ just completed their report. And so there are a lot of things that we know have to be reviewed and looked at. But you've got to understand what your current state is in order to be able to have clear recommendations moving forward. And I know that one of those recommendations is going to be data. Another recommendation I know is this. This problem is not going to solve itself. And frankly, if you read some books that share a lot of really rich information about the current state with incarceration and whatnot, this is one of my favorites, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And you realize that, frankly, the courts aren't going to save us. All right. A lot of what's been happening over the last 30 years is actually protected by the Supreme Court or by rules and precedents. So the community is going to have to be involved. We have to own a big piece of this. And I think that for me personally, that's one of the things that I realized in the 6 minutes, I couldn't even take the whole 8, the 6 minutes that I'm watching George Floyd tragically murdered in front of our eyes. I realized that my disengagement has collateral consequences. And so as a community, yeah, we can ask for a lot of things from BPD, from the Sheriff's Department, from all of the folks in power. But really, as a community, we have allowed them through the culture that has disengaged or not vocalized our opposition to these practices. We have allowed them to do this without any sort of pushback. So I think that the community continuing to be involved and demanding changes, that's got to be a part of the equation as well. We've got to own some of that work, and that's my commitment.
Thank you, Traco. Brady or Romarilyn, did you have other specific thoughts about the question of specific reforms that police and or sheriff department should be implementing if they're trying to effectively reimagine public safety? Maybe Brady, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I think much of what I think I've said and much of what I believe is that the work needs to happen, the bulk of the work needs to happen not inside of police precincts, but outside of them. And that much of what police need to do is to withdraw from many social spaces over which they exercise dominion, and allow allow other institutions and community members to step in that are more appropriate for those functions. So I would say removing police from schools, right? We've heard from both of the panelists about the school to prison pipeline, which is very real. What we're trying to construct is a prison to college pipeline to counteract that dynamic. But having police in schools, especially at the K through 12 level, has been devastating, right? They're disproportionately present in communities of color, and that means that disproportionately behavioral issues or truancy, right? That in suburban, predominantly, kind of white communities are dealt with inside of schools and inside of communities with measures like, parent conferences and suspension or detention, and at the most expulsion. In the case of racialized communities where police presence is abundant within the school, those issues are automatically lead youth into the criminal legal system. So removing police from schools, I think, is essential if those schools are going to serve as mechanisms, right, for empowerment and life affirmation. But also really taking a scalpel to the legal immunity, the wide, expansive, irresponsible, and unaccountable power that police and prosecutors, frankly, enjoy in the criminal legal system, which renders them immune to certainly criminal and even civil recourse for instances not just of for instances of violence, but also egregious egregious error, right, that leads to harm. So I think, and the fact of the matter is that some of the immunity that certainly prosecutors enjoy, when you trace the genealogy of that immunity, it leads directly back to slavery, right? It leads directly back to the irresponsible power that Frederick Douglass articulated that the overseer exercised on the plantation, right? So no one is safe, right? Democracies are supposed to, are supposed to work in such a way as to invest in self-governance, right? And work against the illiberal, illiberal centralization of tyrannical and unaccountable power. And the fact of the matter is that even virtuous people, wonderfully well-intentioned people who inhabit the prosecutorial function, who inhabit the police function, find themselves in a structure that doesn't incentivize virtuous action, and that really eclipses the accountability that I think democracy really demands that our public officials have, right? That they're accountable to the communities that they're called upon to serve, and so legal immunity, I think, is something that should be repealed.
So I wanted to thank you, Brady, and actually, Romarilyn, I wanted to ask a specific version of this question to you because there's several questions in the chat that are, including one that's directed to you specifically that relates to one of the issues that Brady mentioned that you mentioned earlier, and I believe Traco did as well, which is the school to prison pipeline. So this question comes from Aaron, and it says, Ms. Ralston, you mentioned that public resource officers in lower education, like middle schools, are a pipeline for incarceration. Is it your belief that they are causing more harm? How does their relationship to the school affect public safety? And I think Aaron means maybe the relationship of public resource officers in education and in schools. Is that why exactly is that a harm? And can you say more about why you see that as problematic in your view, or related to the school to prison pipeline? You're on mute there.
I have to remember to do that. Thank you for the question. Most of the resource officers are heavily in areas where schools, in Black and brown schools. There's not just resource officers, but there's metal detectors. There's patrol cars outside. And so it's just another layer of the over-policing that and surveillance that happens within Black and brown communities. And so when we, people that look like me and Traco, leave our homes going to school, we're going to pass a couple of cop cars on the way to school, most likely. And then when we get to school, now we're going to have our bags searched. We're going to have to go through a metal detector. And then if a teacher or some other staff person in the school doesn't like my attitude, then they call the resource officer. The resource officer is an apparatus of discipline. And usually when they get involved, they're like law enforcement. They come to apprehend. They come to contain and control a situation. Very few times have we seen de-escalation of situations in schools. We've seen many YouTube videos and clips on Facebook with resource officers handcuffing 5-year-olds, pushing young girls to the ground, body slamming women. And so these are some of the problems that we see with resource officers. They kind of step out of their lane into law enforcement. And it's just, like I said, another layer of surveillance and over policing that Black and brown kids have to endure. And they shouldn't have to endure that. When you go to school, it should be a nice experience, not a pat down situation, and not a situation where you are surveilled to the point where you don't feel like you have a place to learn. You're always under the eye and the watch of something, or the threat of being handcuffed and kicked out of school. It's that kind of stress that Black and brown kids are raised in. And it's that kind of stress that Black and brown kids grow into adulthood carrying in their bodies. That kind of stress and that kind of idea of who police are. When you start teaching children in school that this is what their life is worth, and this is how you're going to be treated at 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, you just set children up for failure. And then you push them out into the community where they have to fend for themselves oftentimes, which leads to all kinds of activities that lead to prison. And so that's part of the problem.
Thank you. And Traco, did you have something to add there?
Yes, I just wanted to affirm what Romarilyn was saying and then speak to why this discretionary response matters so much. So here's a fun stat that I took from the book I just shared earlier. Did you know that approximately 10% of the American population violates drug laws each year. So we're talking, 25 to 30 million people in America, the majority of which are white. All right. But 75% of all people who have been in prison for drugs have been Black or Latinx. So that discretionary response, so here's the thing, no law enforcement agency has the capacity to respond to everyone, whether it's on a high school campus or whether it's in the community. And so they get to choose. And if I had two ponds, all right, in one pond, I only grew catfish and in another I grew snapper. If I only fish in one pond, what do you think I'm gonna eat? Whichever pond I fish in. And so that discretionary response, that's the reason why you see 90% Black and Latinx people in California prisons today and nationally. That is the exclusive reason. So that behavior starts on high school campuses, but really it's across the board. It's ubiquitous.
Thank you for that comment and those helpful responses. We have a number of questions here that are on so many fascinating topics. I want to ask them all at once, but
Michael, before you get in, I want to point out something really significant, right? A point of agreement between Traco and Romarilyn, and a point of, articulating something that is common knowledge in Black and brown communities, but that I think is not, right, in many white communities. And so earlier you asked a question about areas of common ground and elements, like you mentioned radical elements of disagreement in our communities when it comes to police reform. And I think a lot of that disagreement really is rooted in people inhabiting divergent social positions and inhabiting very different information ecosystems, right? A recent study found that 77% of white people had no contact with police in the previous year. And of those who did, right, at least half of that contact were traffic stops. And in many cases, white people initiated contact by calling the police. So what that tells me is that most white people have little unwanted contact with police. So as a result, many of white people's opinions about police aren't based on personal experience, aren't based on the experience of their community members, but rather are based on the images circulated through Hollywood and the dominant media, right? And those images themselves are overwhelmingly produced by other white people, right? But as we've heard from Traco and Romarilyn, and as we've heard from countless other Black and brown people over decades, right? Is that people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, and not just anecdotally, we've shown like the facts bear this out, right? Empirical data, right? Bears this out, right? The Black and Indigenous people have much higher rates of unwanted contact with police, right? And a lot of that I think has to do with the presence of police in in schools and racialized communities, right? As Romarilyn has spoken to, and fishing exclusively, in the snapper pond, right? Which is to say, racialized policing practices, which themselves, right? If you're only fishing in one pond, right? To build on Traco's metaphor further, right? And you're only coming into contact with one kind of lawbreaker, right? Even though it's because of the investment of resource and intention into that particular pond or community, right? It reinforces perceptions, right, of disproportionate law breaking taking place in that community, when in reality, right, law breaking knows no color, right, in that respect, right? So anyway, I think overcoming the disagreements around police reform, right, and criminal legal reform, I think has to do with addressing those very different social positions and experiences. And for white people, to really have some intellectual and moral curiosity, right, to hear and listen, right, with empathetic understanding to those who are positioned in communities that are very frequently subject to unwanted police contact, right? To understand what that's like, right? And I think what we've seen this year, a multiracial coalition, as Romarilyn mentioned. I mean, one of the largest civil rights protests, if not the largest civil rights protests in the history of this country, right? So I think increasingly, white people, especially young white people, they are listening, right? And I think that curiosity, that listening is imperative if we're going to live up to the ideals of equality, which are, at the bedrock of the country, though an unfinished project. If we're going to live up to the ideal that Traco mentioned at the beginning of this panel about constructing a beloved, right, and inclusive family or community.
Yeah, thanks so much for making those connections, Brady. I think it's really well said, and also for the call for listening, understanding beyond your own experience. I think it's a crucial message. And on that note, actually, I want to share two comments and then a question. So one comment coming from President Lynette Zelezny, President of California State University, Bakersfield. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Zelezny. Dr. Zelezny writes, excellent enlightening discourse. Thank you to our outstanding expert panelists and to the Kegley Institute. So thanks so much, President Zelezny, for being with us. We also have a comment from Dolores Huerta, who's with us tonight. And she notes a comment on police slangs in Kern County. Police should not be judge, jury, and executioners. So thank you for that comment and for all of your work and more and your leadership. We appreciate you being with us tonight. It's really an honor. Thank you. A question we have here comes from an anonymous attendee that follows up on Dolores Huerta's comment. This year, particularly after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, there was a light shine on the call to action to divest and invest. So this follows up on some themes we've talked about. What would it look like more specifically to defund / abolish the police as it is and invest in other institutions? For example, to make this more specific, when looking at our city's budget, what line item should we be looking at? And how can the layperson get more involved in this kind of work? And this person also says, thanks to me and to the panelists for doing this event. Anybody want to respond to her question or this person's question initially?
Michael, I think again, per my role on the BPD Community Collaborative, I think it would be premature for me to make that recommendation without the consensus of the group. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to defer on that particular one, speaking about a specific Bakersfield line item.
Right. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And Brady, you had kind of given us the graphic about illustrating what it might mean to defund police, and there were some useful images on there. Can you maybe talk about one of the specific examples that you had in mind and what it might look like in practice, what a defunding move might look like for a city or reform movement taking that seriously, maybe even in collaboration with the police department? What might that look like?
Yeah, well, so thank you for the question and for the comments. It's a privilege to be. I wish we were in the same space because we're clearly sharing space with impactful community members. So that's a privilege, and I'm thankful. These are great questions. So I think it's really important for all of us to understand that policing is a local, municipal, and is overwhelmingly a local, municipal, and county affair, right? One of the things that Black Lives Matter movement has really brought to the fore is that budgets are moral documents, right? And so I think that that's part of the spirit from which this question comes, right? Is that and part of the spirit of Traco's heart acronym, right? Where's our heart? Right? Look at the budget, right? That's part of where our heart. So And when you do look, and so this is going to require organization, coordination, and engagement at the local level. It's so important, right? And in this moment, it's important for me to say, I think at the tail end of what every 4 years is a longer and longer presidential campaign, right? A lot of folks feel exhausted, and justifiably so, at the end of that. And a lot of folks then disengage. We've seen record levels of political engagement at the ballot box this year, and I think that's a great sign, right? But that's just the beginning, right, of what needs to be, an ongoing engagement and holding elected officials accountable. But also, so we need to not invest exclusively on the ballot box. We need to not invest our political energies narrowly or disproportionately on national elections. We also, a lot of this is happening at the local level, right? So engagement at the local level is so key and so important, right? That's why you have, Romarilyn and I involved in Orange County Justice, Hope, and Healing dialogue with community stakeholders and police chiefs and elected officials. That's why you have Traco and Michael on this panel in your region, right? Working in community, right, in your county to address these issues at the county level. And when you do look at those county and municipal budgets across the country, and certainly across the state, you will see that disproportionately upwards of, and sometimes more than 50% of those budgets are devoted to police. Okay, so what are some of the other line items, right, that are being disinvested, or marginalized because of that investment? Libraries, right? Social centers, parks and recreation, right? Those are, historically the affordable and accessible avenues for sort of meaningful activity and engagement for poor and poor youth, right? Housing, affordable, safe housing, right? There's an epidemic, right, of housing that this pandemic has exacerbated and brought to the fore, right? So investing in affordable housing, I think, is one. In investing in social work and mental health care provisions, right? So that we're not calling upon police to show up to address homelessness, right? To show up to address mental health crisis, but that we have a more varied, a more robust, and a more life-affirming array of institutions, and it requires money, right? In order for those institutions to operate in any kind of way that we're going to be able to expect, results. Not not hustling after grants every other month, right? If we invest the degree to which we have been investing in what I believe has been a failed system, right, into those varied alternatives, again, like housing, childcare, right, mental health and physical health, I think that we will see measurable, kinds of results that are well worth that reinvestment.
And if I could just add a couple of things, and thank you, Brady, for that, because it's really important for our elected officials at the local level to really engage with community members, because, board of supervisors and other folks who have these huge budgets, they are spending enormous amounts of the budget on policing. Instead of reaching out to the community members, to the people, and asking the people what their needs are, and really working for the people. And I think that's really important. A lot of the money can be shifted to provide political education for community members, to to help educate community members. Many of our community members are low income. We talked about, $37,000 or less folks are making. And so we see a lot of these communities members ending up in prison. So how do we create job development programs and housing? Because, once we have some safe, affordable, quality housing, that's great. But folks need employment, they need political education, they need to feel secure in their communities, and parks is a part of that, and libraries and social service, community centers. All of these are wonderful things to have. But unless the elected official is allocating that money to the people and speaking to the people, and not just holding weekly meetings that most community members are not even aware that are happening. Some may not know how to get the information on where the meeting is happening. So there's just a lot of structural things that need to happen so that the people are really controlling the budgets in their communities, in their counties, in their states, especially locally. And once the people realize that they have the power to move this money, and I think folks have realized that they have the power to move this money, and that's what this whole defund movement is about. It's our money. We're taxpayers too, and we have the power to say where it goes, and we are speaking. And like Dr. King said, I think he said a riot is the voice of the unheard or something like that. And so we see people standing up and telling the world what they want in their communities, and they want equity, they want inclusion, and they want equal access.
Thank you, Romarilyn. And we have time for maybe a few more questions. I also want to save just a few minutes for just final comments from each panelist. This is a resource question, so I'm wondering, possibly Brady and Romarilyn, you might have some resource suggestions here that we could maybe even put in chat. This question comes from Lynn. Can you cite any peer-reviewed research or research that demonstrates unequivocally a robust correlation between in-prison education and lowered recidivism rates? Is there any research you know of in that area?
First one comes to my mind is the Rand Corporation, but go ahead, Brady.
Yeah, so the Rand study is really one of the only studies that's around right now, and it's a meta-analysis of education programming inside of prisons across the country, and shows that for every dollar invested in education programs, the state or the government saves $4 to $5 in criminal legal expenditures because of the impact that education programs have, positive impact in reducing recidivism and providing meaningful pathways for folks upon release to reintegrate and seek and secure employment and prosperity. But I will say that there's a lack of robust research around this question, largely because of the evacuation of state investment in education inside of prisons across the country, right? The crime bill of 1996, right, eliminated the eligibility of incarcerated people for Pell Grants. And overnight, hundreds of college programs in prisons across the country closed their doors, and the only ones that remained were those that could rely upon philanthropic funding, right? The Obama administration Department of Education reintroduced Pell eligibility in an experimental sites program for a limited number of about 200, a little over 200 college and prison programs. But it is, and in California, SB 1391 has allowed community colleges to offer college credit-bearing courses inside of the state prison system. And so I think California, between SB 1391 and the work that community colleges are doing inside, Project Rebound, the Underground Scholars and Rising Scholars in the 3 segments of public higher education to support formerly incarcerated students across the state. I think California has a lot to be proud of in terms of the work that we're doing to make education, higher education, a viable option, but for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. But the pandemic really is poised to roll back a lot of that progress right now. So there is, and I will say that among the 14 California State University campuses in which, on which Project Rebound is operating and providing community and wraparound support for formerly incarcerated students, our students are, we have a 0% recidivism rate. So just let that sit there for a second. We have a 0% recidivism rate, right? But that's just a minimal metric, right, of our success, because our students aren't just desisting, right, from crime or not returning to prison, right? They're outpacing and outperforming their traditional student counterparts academically and in student life and leadership, right? So yes, right. Education has an evidentiary record and a wide anecdotal record of reducing recidivism, but really of creating opportunities, right, for system impacted people to pursue, prosperity and empowerment. But there's much more, programming to be supported, and much more research, right, to be funded to really get into the fine grain, right, of best practices, and that's part of what we have the privilege of doing in the Project Rebound Consortium.
Thank you, Brady. I wanted to note a comment here from just related to this from Dr. Thomas Wallace, who's a leader at CSUB in several capacities, including student affairs, but several elements of our university. And Dr. Wallace notes, it would help if we analyze the state expenditures made for K-12 education compared to the cost for housing a prisoner. If we allocated more money for youth programs, I believe less would be required to spend on them as prisoners. Just kind of a comment following up on Brady's discussion there. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. A final question I'll ask here before we get to just final concluding thoughts from the panelists. And Traco, I think I'm going to address this to you. This is from Steve, and Steve's noting, how does Kern County move forward as one community while also recognizing our different experiences and needs?
Steve, that's a great question. And I think it goes back to a response I started to speak about earlier. And it's about finding that common ground. And one of the things that I'll just speak to this kind of from my social pastoring role. I know often people, they struggle with the level of priority this work should have. And I want to speak to those people of faith who are listening tonight, because I think that's one huge area that no one ever really talks about, but it's common. I think that every person of faith should embrace this work because it is sacred. All right. It doesn't matter which religion you are from. Really, this is about human dignity. And so just from that perspective, I think that should be a common ground where we can all at least start to have this conversation and not choke each other and not throw things at each other or try to kill each other, because we're trying to affirm the dignity of humans. I think that's ethical. I think that is right. People have the right to flourish and grow and thrive, and they have the right to be redeemed and restored. They have the right to not be discriminated against. They have the right to not have their fish be the only one that's being fished in. These are human dignity issues, and I think that's a good place where we can start. But I also know that Kern County is a Judeo-Christian community. And so I want to speak directly to folks out there who are Christians, all right? This is work that Jesus did. And I want to take you to Matthew, the 25th chapter, verses 34 through 40, where he talks about a lot of good work. And it says, in as much as you've done it to the least of these, my brothers, you've done it to me. All right. And so we prioritize feeding the hungry. We prioritize clothing those who have no clothes and sheltering the homeless. Well, guess what? In that litany of things that he speaks about, the other one is visiting people in prison. And that word visiting is about care. It's about attending to, it's about making sure that they have that opportunity for restoration, redemption, the opportunity to flourish and thrive again. And so I think that that is a huge area of common ground, that sacred work, ethical, moral work that really many of us can get around and wrap our minds around. And I implore you, this is the mandate. Let's do it together.
Thank you, Traco. Well said. Well said. Man, we could probably spend all night talking. This has been so fascinating, but I want to be mindful of our time. And I wanted to invite our panelists to share closing thoughts, for maybe some final thoughts you want to share with our audience tonight before we close out. And I did want to remind people, I put a chat to the event survey in chat for everybody. If you could complete that, that helps us for our grant reporting purposes, which helps sponsor events like this. So thank you. Romarilyn, can we start with you for some any final thoughts you'd like to share as we close out tonight?
Well, first I'd like to say amen to Traco. Amen. So thank you so much for bringing in the gospel. Okay. So thank you for that. So I'll just close with saying, we're all in this together. If we want our communities to thrive and we want other people to thrive and do more than just survive, then we need to all do our part and start treating one another the way that we want to be treated. And I think that's what this is all about. And if you want to know more about incarcerated people, then get involved. There's pen pal programs, there's visiting programs, there's Project Rebound, there's a whole bunch of programs where you can volunteer and get involved and get to know people. If you are a white person and you want to know what the Black community, the brown community has been experiencing all of their lives for 400 years or more, there's lots of organizations, there's lots of workshops, anti-racist workshops that you can learn about how to be an ally, how to support folks. So there's no reason in this day and age with the technology that we have that any of us should not be able to sit down and communicate with one another and to work things out. Turn off the TV and have a conversation. Reach out to people around you who look different than you, and stop assuming the worst of individuals and give people a chance.
Thank you,
Romarilyn. And divest and be fun.
Thank you, Romarilyn. Brady.
Divest and reunify, right? Is that we're moving toward? Yes, I think, there's something about, turn off the TV, but, I also think, speak to your neighbors, right? And not just the echo chambers of social media, which I think, I just want to say, this is potentially off topic, but I just want to say it's surprising to me how how unconcerned or unaware that many people are, that there are hundreds of Russian, coders sitting in rooms who are creating bots that are putting out messages through social media with the direct intention of turning, differently situated Americans against one another, of turning neighbors against one another, and of eroding democratic institutions. Right now, I think we can also, share a great deal of the blame for eroding democratic institutions ourselves, right? But there are, external agents who are involved. And so the layers of mediation that separate people that otherwise share a lot in common, right? If there was some of that empathetic listening, right? If there was some of that, intellectual and moral curiosity and intellectual and moral humility, right? That I think is required for flourishing communities to be created, to be return to the precept that I began with, or that inclusive family, right? That Traco began with. And so I think that, that some of that listening needs to happen. And I think this panel was what, well, so the last thing I'll say, I lost my train of thought, but regained it. I have a lot of hope and optimism precisely because I am in the classroom with 18 to 28-year-olds on the regular. And 18 to 28-year-olds, and I have a very diverse student body. And the classroom is a microcosmic civic space, right? And the richness of dialogue, the moral virtue and intellectual virtue that students demonstrate in the classroom, listening, exercising open-mindedness, not shying away from potentially divisive topics, right? Questioning their own social position, right? Relative to contrary points of view and perspectives that their classmates raise, and doing so in such a way, that acknowledges that we're still part of, despite disagreements and divergent social positions and perspectives, we're still part of a community, right? So I have great hope and optimism precisely because of the youth, right? Who and as irony would have it, right? The stereotype is that the youth won't get off the social media, right? And yet I see some of these virtues in greater abundance, and I think the pandemic has exacerbated the erosion of some of those basic virtues and in the greater public. And so I hope that folks will put it down and engage in various ways.
Yeah, I agree. And I just would add quick, without exaggeration, I could say one of the most inspiring parts of my days is generally students, and for precisely the reasons you're saying. And people say, no one can listen to each other, no one can talk to each other. Like I said, that is not my experience with students that I'm working with. It is not, and it's something that gives me a lot of hope and positivity. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Traco, final thoughts?
Sure. Just want to close by saying thank you again, Dr. Burrows and the Kegley Institute for having this conversation, for hosting it, but also to all of you who are still listening. It takes courage to engage in these types of conversations because they are controversial. And I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you for your quiet courage and your bold courage, for those who are demonstrating both out there. And thank you for making this at least enough of a priority to participate tonight. And my closing thoughts would be just to encourage everyone to fully put their heart in this work. All right. So what that means is wherever it is currently on your priority scale, I think what George Floyd did for me was it elevated it to a much higher level and said, things are not going to change until many of us are prioritizing this work at a much higher level. That's individuals, that's police departments, that's court systems, that's corrections, that's everyone. We've got to prioritize this work and find a way to make it better together. So thank you for doing that. Fully engage, acquire acumen, learn more, read, talk to people, listen, as others were saying, and then with your resources, find a way to donate some of your money in addition to your time. I don't know if Project Rebound takes donations, but if they do, donate to Project Rebound. And then find some way to hold yourself accountable and others as well. Hold your elected officials accountable. Hold those of us who are part of the collaborative accountable. This is only going to change when all of us are fully engaged with our hearts and holding each other accountable for actual progress and success in this space. I'll end with these words from the Declaration of Independence. I look forward to the day when truly, we live out the meaning of these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, all people, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I ask everyone who's listening tonight, please help us make that a reality for people who look like me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Traco and Romarilyn and Brady. This has been an education. It's been inspiring. It's been a wonderful conversation. Number of comments have come in from the audience thanking you for your collaboration, your conversation, and your insights tonight. And I want to thank, most importantly, our audience for being with us. The events we put on as an institute are for you and because of you, and it's a real honor to be part of our community and help foster these conversations. So thanks for being with us. It's been a privilege. And continue to join us and follow us, Kegley Institute, on social media. We're coming towards the end of our event calendar for this semester, but we'll have a really robust calendar again coming up in the spring, and a lot of free and open events like this. So we look forward to seeing you then, and stay safe and be well. And again, thank you to our panelists, and have a wonderful night, everybody. We'll be seeing you again soon.